Hello, I'm Helgast. When starting Nostalgic November, I planned to cover WipEout HD, because I went under the assumption that HD was a remaster of WipEout 1 for the PS1, only to get hit by reality, since WipEout HD is a collection of WipEout Pulse and WipEout Pure, two PSP games rebuilt from the ground up to take advantage of the PS3 hardware, having the games get a graphical facelift, while running at a constant 60 FPS. The graphical facelift can be seen in both games, but the boost to the FPS can only be seen in WipEout Pure, due to Pure only being able to run at 30 FPS on the PSP. So I picked two PSP games versus remaking the PS1 originals. This was the time of HD gaming, with development costs were skyrocketing, all due to development teams having to make higher quality assets for HD TVs. So to get some experience on the notoriously hard to develop for PS3, the developers Liverpool Studios picked the last two games because it would be easier to develop, while also being cost efficient for their HD debut. This would also be the start of digital games, a direction HD decided to fully embrace, as it would be a digital only launch with the goal of pushing more people onto the PlayStation Network, a move that was being pushed by Sony to normalize bigger digital games. As in 2008 the game would release, and a year later the game would get a DLC called WipEout Fury, plus getting a physical release only in the EU for some reason. With HD behind the devs, they would start their next WipEout project, where WipEout would return back onto the handheld, with PlayStation Vita's WipEout 2048. This would be a year one game for the Vita, which tends to be one of the most vital games for a console. And these tend to be the games that show off what a console is really capable of. Here, Liverpool would show off the graphical power that the Vita is capable of. The push for better graphical presentation left the game capped at 30 FPS. Graphics were a highlight for many outlets at the time. 2048 would also push crossplay between PS3 and PS Vita, which was another thing Sony was pushing hard. So if you owned WipEout HD, you would get HD tracks for free on 2048. If you didn't own HD, then you could get access to the tracks by buying a map pack for $7.99. Things were looking good as Liverpool was already in the design process for the next WipEout game in 2012. The same year, Sony would shut down Liverpool Studios. In 2016, Sony would also shut down Evolution Studios, the developers that brought Drive Club and MotorStorm, bringing our story to senior producer John McLaughin at Sony's XDev team, a studio that typically does support work for other Sony projects. His background consists of many racing games, with a lot of his career working at Evolution Studios. He would say that racing games are in his blood, and he wanted to work on some sort of racing game. Looking at the last few WipEout games, he got an estimate for how long a remaster would take. The team gave him an estimate of a year, where the development of the Omega Collection began. The team spent a lot of time on the multiplayer component of the game, rebuilding that aspect from the ground up, while updates to the visuals across HD, Fury, and 2048. The team also put additional love to 2048, giving it split screen and having it run consistently at 60 FPS. Where history would repeat itself again, as someone wondered why the recent games and not the PS1 or PS2 games. Where in an interview, John would reveal that this was the easiest course to take, as they wanted to get this out as quickly as possible. The rest of the development seems to have gone smoothly, and it would launch in 2017, getting both a digital and physical release, where the EU would get an alternative cover art, making the game look more akin to the PS1 games. Wait, why? Why would you give the Omega Collection's cover art that's similar to the PS1 games? Since this collection is just PSP and Vita games, this had to confuse buyers. Hell, I didn't need a cover to be confused by this collection. But enough babbling about the game's history, let's jump right on into the game's story. When reviewing a game, I like to stick with what's given in-game. Now, the Omega Collection doesn't give a fuck about a story, as it wants us racing immediately. So let's talk about that gameplay. Before we can even start the conversation about the controls, we have to talk about the game modes in HD, because the game doesn't have a career mode. Instead, we get multiple cups to go through. Each cup has a certain amount of events for the player to go through. In order to unlock other cups, we need to get a certain amount of points, which are earned by getting gold, silver, or bronze medals in events. To do this, the game brings out different modes in each cup. These range from tournaments, which you have to go through X amount of races where the higher your position gives points. The goal is to have the most points. Then we have single race. These are sort of self-explanatory. It's a singular race, where you have to place first, second, or third to win. Speed lap gives you 7 laps for you to go around to get the fastest lap time. Hit or get below the required time to get your gold medal. Time trial, it's similar to speed lap except that you have to have the fastest combined lap times. Finally, we have the zone mode, which is HD's best mode, as it plays into WipEout's strength with it being about pure speed. As you start in the lowest zone, with a manageable amount of speed. The longer you last will cause you to get into new zones, which will heal you and make you go faster. The goal is to get to a certain zone to get that gold medal. Having to keep at these speeds brings us to the controls. As the first thing that I noticed is that the game supports an older control scheme, where R2 isn't how to accelerate, leaving me to look stupid on my first attempt. Instead of PlayStation, you have to use X to accelerate, which isn't done to have some cheap attempt at some nostalgia, but this is done to the game's unique braking system. As you have your standard brake, having you lose most of your speed. If you use either triggers, it will cause you to slightly brake and turn left or right. This makes it so that you can make those sharp turns without losing all your speed, a mechanic that is essential to mastering the game, as using this effectively allows you to keep at that breakneck speed. Scattered on the track are these boosts in the form of these blue arrows. During races there are these red X's on the tracks which give out weapons and defensive items. The items themselves stay in the realm of the sci-fi setting, so we have machine guns, missiles, lasers, shields, and a few other items. There isn't anything that's equivalent to the blue shell from other games of weapons, so you have to plan around using these weapons. Another aspect that gives the weapons a bit more depth is the health mechanic. Being shot by other weapons, crashing into walls, or doing a barrel roll to get a small boost causes for your health to drop. The health drop stays throughout the race, and if you take enough damage, you will be eliminated. The only way of getting health back is by sacrificing the weapon or item you have. What gives more thought when getting a weapon, because you have to think, do you want to use that machine gun to get a small amount of damage, or save it in order to heal when you get low on health? This small addition to combat helps make the racing more interesting, because the AI can easily be seen following a racing line. By attempting to pass it makes them really aggressive, as they're willing to ram or shoot you in order to keep their position. Their aggression plus a warning system that informs you when and what the AI is firing, which helps keep the races exciting, due to having to juggle your health, weapons, and keeping at the fast pace. Something that gets lost when you hit first place, as it's too easy to stay in the front, since the AI will struggle to get back in the first place without you making some serious fuck-ups, or when the AI has something to slow you dead in your tracks. This system is great, but gets lost when playing speed lap or time trials, as these modes lose the other AI racers, as it instead focuses on speed. You're not in danger of dying due to your health instantly regenerating, making you free to do as many barrel rolls and hit as many walls as you wish. Items are also gone, as instead you have a singular boost that gets replaced after every lap, as the game instead expects you to find the best route to get those great times, but it makes the game feel less eventful because you're never in the danger of dying at any time. Then we have the game's last mode, the zone mode. While touching on it earlier, this mode is where the game really shines, as it takes the speed needed with speed laps and time trails while making us be careful like in races, because damage is turned up to an all-time high which only increases when you get faster. The only way to heal is to get to another zone, which is satisfying to do, as you feel like you're barely in control of this machine, especially when hitting another zone and it changes all the colors in the track. It makes all the modes feel different while the controls themselves feel great. The only thing holding this game back is the amount of tracks, as this game only has 8 tracks in WipEout HD. Now racing games with a low amount of tracks can do fine. It all comes down to how the game can pace out a small amount of tracks. To work, the game has to be willing to show off new tracks while having some repeat tracks. An element that HD doesn't even attempt, because it's normal to play the same track 4+ times in a single cup, only to play that track 2 to 3 more times in the next cup. It makes the amount of replaying tracks to start being repetitive, which is hard to do because racing games in general expect that the player is willing to replay tracks in search of getting the best times or first places in all the events. But it quickly stopped being an interesting aspect due to how often the tracks repeated. Like, why would I want to get the perfect time on a track I just played 5+ times, especially when trying to get perfect the last few times? It's disappointing that I can be easily bored with these tracks, as the track design is superb. I wish that the game would either shuffle the tracks around a bit more, or have the tracks that didn't have any breaks or jumps in them to have a reverse version of the track, as this would allow for a change of pace. Now, the most realistic approach that the developers could have gone through is to cut some of the races from the cup, because the game would still have some replay value without some of the events. And the game also has the online portion for those who still want to sink their teeth into it. It just feels like the game has a lot of unnecessary fat throughout the entire thing. However, for the gameplay cover, we're moving on to the sounds. Throughout many of my reviews, sound and music tends to be the short section, since I find it rather odd to describe feelings about sounds and music, as a lot of times it comes down to things sound nice or that thing sticks out of place or sounds bad. It's something that I don't want to be short, since all aspects of a game are extremely important. While many, myself included, will say that gameplay is the most important aspect of a game, that's not entirely true. For me, most of the time it's the story that is an aspect that the game doesn't have to be great for me to be invested. However, sounds are really important to a game for me. It can easily take me out of a game during a crucial moment, like when stock sound effects are being played at crucial dramatic moments, or the absolute worst is when the sound design is just bad. The importance of sound in games is something that's really underrated, as most of the times you see people rave about a soundtrack. Depending on how the developers use it, it might be the least amount of sounds that you hear in the game. So it's frustrating to see things like the soundtrack or what gets talked about or praised more than the rest of the sounds in a game. Now, to stop myself from doing too much rambling, since I had to rewrite this plenty of times and cut out a lot of examples I had for games and their respective genres, every game genre has to focus on very specific elements to sell what's really happening in the game. Racing games have to focus on the sound of the vehicles, from the explosion engines of supercars, something plenty of games have captured in the fullest. So one thing that separates these cars from the vehicles in Wipeout is the amount of speed that they get, which is something that falls flat in the game. While they do sound futuristic, they don't have that sense of power. Looking at another interview, this didn't seem to be the intention. But with only having a year of development, the game had some tight deadlines, leaving the sound as it is. The ships don't sound powerful compared to other games of the same genre and style. For comparisons, I will be having side-by-sides of the ships from Wipeout and Redout 2. Wipeout doesn't have that oomph that Redout ships have, as we're not piloting these multi-billion-dollar ships capable of these speeds, as instead we're in these fancy Roombas going for that dirt. The weapons and items for the ships have a range of sounding great to getting the job done. The shields have this bass sound while activating it, which just feels right for a shield. Missiles have the right amount of punch to make them feel strong, having them be a worthwhile to use. Then you have things like the machine guns that just sound weak, which is accurate considering that they barely do any damage. Most of the sounds are good, and there are some to bring some small surprises, like using a boost item or hitting the aforementioned blue boost arrows, which makes the ship sound like they're being pushed as far as they can. It sounds far better. Well, unless you're like me, who spends most of the time grinding their ship against the wall. Man, I hope I can break the bad habit of using these boosts at the wrong time.
Big one, take us behind those rocks.
Moving behind the rocks.
Keep going. You're good. You're good. You're good. And stop. Don't worry, Captain. We'll buff out those scratches.
However, these aren't the only noises happening in the game, as it's filled with music. So let's touch on that. The Omega Collection has an entirely new soundtrack to accompany the 3 games. To keep with the futuristic angle, the entire soundtrack is filled with EDM and club music, meaning that we have a mix of fast-paced songs and slow burners that have long build-ups, which is alright for most modes except for speed laps. Because when we get a song that has a long build-up, there's a good chance that you can beat the race before the song can drop, which is a problem, because the drop in these songs tend to go with a speed that can heighten the experience when you're going at max speed and narrowly making the turns. Or in races, when making a daring pass where the music decides to drop makes it that much better. So when the drop happens after you finish the finishing line, it can really deflate the experience in speed laps. It would have been great if the devs pushed to get a few songs that was dedicated to speed laps that were shorter and had quicker drops, so that there'd be less time when the music would never drop, which is the biggest complaint in the game for me, because the way Wipeout implements music is just fantastic, as they do a few simple things that go a long way. For starters, the main menu has its own song, and it's not used in any of the races. A simple thing, but it keeps songs from playing their climax at the main menu, which leads to the second aspect of the music. Restarting a race will have the current song fade out and a new one start. This is to do the same thing as the main menu song. It's a little thing, but really helps keep the music and the pacing of everything going. It's something that you'd be surprised to see how many other racing games don't do. Which wraps up the sounds, bringing us on to the shortest aspect of the review, the graphics. HD came out in 2008, an era where developers would rather shut down their company than use color in their games. It was just an ugly aspect of gaming in that generation, so I was a bit surprised to see that HD had an alright amount of colors. Now this doesn't fully save it, it still uses a lot of ugly grays, that it cramps my eyeballs. Thankfully that has been toned down in the Omega Collection, allowing for more colors to be used on the tracks. The tracks and ships are full of color and packed with a lot of detail, making the game a visual treat. I shouldn't be too surprised since this is a game that features a photo mode. For those that don't know, photo modes in games require for assets to be of a higher quality, which is how you get some of the absurd details in games. My favorite example has to be in Devil May Cry 5 when reloading the shotgun and going into photo mode. You can see the engravings on the shells itself. Something not many would notice unless looking at the models externally or using the photo mode. So everything looks fantastic and crisp, which is a shame that we spend 90% of the time going past it in a blur, especially for such a nice looking game. Bringing me to my final thoughts. WipEout HD is a great game where the main lacking feature is the amount of tracks, mainly in the single player where the game insists on repeating tracks too often, making HD to be a solid 8 out of 10 as a standalone product. However, with this being part of the Omega Collection, it bumps it up a point. It's not an absolute perfect game, due to there being far more tracks. Too bad the game still insists on repeats, which is something that shouldn't be scoffed at. Now it's only a matter of time to see if Sony actually does something with this series, as the last entry was not so well received as a mobile game in 2020. I hope they do something with WipEout, but with so many other dormant IPs, what's another one gonna do? If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. Next time I'm going to be getting my first platinum trophy, so until then, have a fantastic day.
Fuck off.